Big nerfs and new cards have really shaken up the Marvel Snap metagame. Some things changed, some things stayed the same. Let's take a look at the best decks to play to climb to Infinite and climb in Infinite in Marvel Snap. In terms of things that stayed the same, Thanos found its way to a new configuration fairly quickly. This is my recommended ladder build. You'll notice a bit of difference from the way people tend to play this deck in tournaments. In tournaments, you end up being much more worried about opposing Lokis as a major part of the metagame. You include things like Mobius and Mobius. On ladder, you tend to just want to execute your game plan as best you can. You are not locked in there with your bad matchups, and you can just move on and say, you know what, that was a bad matchup, I'll move on. In a tournament, you kind of are locked in there with your bad matchups if you end up playing against them, and you need to be able to have solid game plans into them. So for that reason, this is my recommended build that I think people should be playing on ladder. For the, it's the most generally applicable build of this deck, and you can take it and you can customize it as you want, but generally speaking, this is the deck I would recommend. Thanos is much more a ramp deck plus now. The way I would consider this deck is similar to the Electro decks. It's basically just an Electro deck, except instead of playing bad cards like Electro, it's playing good cards like Hope Summers and Time Stone and Wave, and it's like all a bunch of really powerful things that you're doing. And then on the back end, you are rewarded for early playing of powerful things by the existence of Scar and the fact that you can have final turn Scar plus Shang-Chi much easier than normal thanks to the influence of Hope Summers. This is also a deck that can enable you to play multiple big 6-drops on the final turn of the game with Hope and Wave, and the way the ramp synergizes with itself is very, very good. If you're playing a normal ramp deck and you have Wave and Electro, only one of those is ever getting played. In this deck with Hope, if you have Hope and Wave, that enables something unique, and that kind of dual purpose card is really, really powerful in a general sense and in the specific sense of this deck existing. Thanos, to me, is the #1 deck in the game. It is the deck that sets the pace for the rest of the meta, and I do think it is slightly worse than what it was with Lockjaw. We'll see what happens with Mockingbird. One of the interesting things about this deck, though, is that as a ramp deck, it does have a relatively defined weakness to combo, and for that reason, I have a Professor X in there. The main combo decks that you're going to be playing against are Living Tribunal, Hela, and Phoenix Force. And Professor X is good in at least 2 of those matchups. And that's really all you can ask for, because if you are going to play a card like Professor X, you just need it to be good normally and then good in your bad matchups, and that is what he's doing here. I don't like going off curve. Hope really makes this deck want to do 6 into 6 instead of multiple 5s, and so I really don't like having to play Professor X when I do. But if I am going to go quote-unquote off curve, I have 6 energy because I played something into a Hope Summers, but I'm only using 5 of it because of the Professor X, it better be for something that absolutely wins me the game. Another card that you can include here is Alioth. I mean, yeah, obviously, right? If you're a Professor X deck, you are sort of inclined to get Alioth in here. My personal belief is that Alioth is just not what I would want to do. It's the kind of card I never want to give a Loki gamer. It's the kind of card that I'm not super interested in playing right now. But if you are someone who is a huge sicko and wants to delete your opponent's involvement in the game, yeah, you can totally play Alioth in here. I will note that a lot of the decks in the top 8 of the Snap.fan World Championship were on Professor X Alioth in this list. I regret to inform you that the metagame is full of decks that absolutely cannot beat Shuri Nimrod into 2 things blowing up that Nimrod, and that means that Phoenix Force is back in, if you'll excuse the pun, force. This is a deck that has extremely obvious snap and retreat lines, and a lot of the time, the way this deck works is you win 2 cubes when your opponents realize they can't win the game, and then you win 2 cubes when your opponents realize they can't win the game, and then you run up against some weird stuff that you didn't expect, and then you lose 8 cubes because you're pretty sure you're gonna win, because when you're doing the thing, you're gonna win. That is the identity that this deck has. This is, in my opinion, a deck that has taken not necessarily the spot of Hela, but it occupies a similar role to what Hela did in previous metas, where it's just this very unaccountably large combo deck that you can absolutely win passing 3 turns into Shuri Nimrod, boom, boom. In fact, most of the time someone plays Shuri and snaps me, I'm usually just dead. Like, that is an absolute barn burner of a combo. And that is to say nothing of the way, normal Phoenix Force stuff works, right? With multiple man and Phoenix Force and all the move cards. There's just to say nothing of that, just the Shuri Nimrod stuff is absolutely terrifying. And I think that sort of thing is why this deck is able to be as dangerous as it is right now. It is the kind of deck where you're going to get surprised for 8 some of the time, but a lot of the time, I would say this is similar to playing Galactus, where you snap very early, you know what's going on, you have effectively done your Galactus combo, and the rest of the game is just sort of on rails while your opponent realizes that they're dead. A lot of the time, what you'll notice when you're playing this is you'll snap very early, and if they don't retreat, they're just going to stay in there and see what they can find out, right? Like, there's no downside for your opponent staying in once you've already snapped and they've already accepted the snap. So a lot of games will make you think, even in spots where you're just like 100% to win, you still have to find those lines because you don't know what your opponent is actually staying on. I personally don't enjoy that kind of gameplay, but I know for a fact there are people who do. And I think Phoenix Force is a legit deck to consider in that spot if you were a Hela gamer. Other spots in the metagame are being contended for by a few different decks. This deck, the Hope Summers Midrange Move deck, this version was put together by Big Baby. He actually hit rank 1 with it, beating me on the way. I have a great screenshot of me losing and him hitting rank 1, so shout out to Big Baby. We're going to get him on the channel for a more in-depth breakdown of this list in a little bit. That said, I think this is one of 2 contenders for the fair mid-range deck that does not die to Shang-Chi spot, and I think one of the things that I can tell you for sure is I vastly prefer the builds that are playing Magneto and Doctor Doom as opposed to the ones playing Alioth and Doctor Doom. Magento is so key to having the ability to interact with a lot of decks that would normally combo over your head. For example, Living Tribunal, Magento is kind of the only thing that can ever win you a game against them. Even if it's not a super reliable way to win those games, it is a way to win those games that you just otherwise don't have. He is an extremely powerful card, and while Alioth is actually fairly good in that matchup as well, Magento's broad use case is made broader by the fact that he can just win lanes on his own when you're behind. If you are behind and Magento can win you lanes, he's going to be kind of the only card in the entire game that does that. Now, as far as the other tech here, I actually sort of view the construction of this list as fairly similar to a Sarah tech list. It's saying, what if we played the move stuff and got rid of the bad move cards like Kraven and whatnot, and Elsa and Angela, and instead we just played like actually good cards like Gladiator and Miss Marvel. And one of the things that has allowed this deck to do is put Shadow King in there. And Shadow King is actually pretty useful because of the preponderance of Phoenix Force decks right now. You're getting Shuri Nimrod? Nah, you're good. You're getting Phoenix Force? Nah, you're good. It's the kind of card that actually answers a weirdly large percentage of the decks that beat this deck specifically. Because without a card like Shadow King, you are dead to either Phoenix Force combo plan. And that means that you kind of have to run it if you want. The major worry I have for this deck and this archetype as a whole is Loki. Loki is typically quite powerful into that, but I will say, in my time playing Loki, I haven't been really impressed with Loki right now. We'll see if he ends up, making his way back to the top of the metagame, but right now I felt fairly unimpressed with what he's been able to do, and a lot of that is because of the other deck that's competing for this spot in the meta. Discard is just a really good, really strong, really solid deck. A lot of free points, a lot of inability to deal with the points that it's putting on the board, a lot of ability to dodge Shang-Chi, and some surprising flexibility in terms of build. I've been playing against versions with Corvus Glaive. I've been playing against Helicarrier versions. As a note, you're going to ask me, what can I replace Meek with? The answer is Helicarrier. I'm not even sure it's worse in any way. When you get Helicarrier in there, you can start thinking about, the Collector as a serious big boy threat, as opposed to just Meek being that, sort of mini Morbius. I think it is a very, very close decision between those two. And if you are someone who does not want to go by Meek, I think it is totally fine to run the Helicarrier there, and it might even just be better. I honestly think there's a chance the Helicarrier is just straight up correct because of the way it gives you these random outs to situations that you otherwise have no outs to. It adds this sort of confusion level to how you play the game that is quite powerful when it pays off. Obviously, it's not always good, but sometimes it really, 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 really is. So Discard is competing with the Hope Move Midrange deck for the fair mid-range slot in the metagame. And I personally don't know which one's better. I've enjoyed the Hope one more because I sort of view it as like, you know me, I like the little reactive mid-range. It's a little bit more, fair and interactive, whereas this deck is a little bit more, I'm doing points and it is what it is. So we'll see which one ends up coming out on top. This deck has the advantage of being significantly harder to interact with, where the other deck has the advantage of being able to run those tech cards like Shadow King and Shang-Chi. And I think whatever ends up being important in this metagame, those are the things that are going to differentiate it. Another advantage this deck has is that it is a lot better into Loki than the Move deck, and if Loki ends up becoming a major force in the metagame, that will definitely impact which one of these ends up taking the spot. So let's talk about Loki. I personally have tried a bunch of weird pixie Loki stuff, some other things of that nature, and eventually just kind of figured that I wasn't having a lot of success with Loki generally. So we ended up back on the just default build of Loki. You can try other stuff in here. Alioth is a card people play in and out here. Vision is a card people play in and out here. I know Revis was playing, of course, he was playing the Legion in here. And I think generally I prefer the Dino. Just, it's a big guy. I like big guys. It is what it is. But I think there is something to be said for there being quite a few decks where Loki, the card, is not very good right now. Phoenix Force on the uptick. Hela, of course, it's terrible. Any Black Knight deck, it's a terrible card. The discard decks, you get some cards, but usually they're able to be better than you. It's a little bit awkward in a lot of matchups right now. And I think Loki, for me, is a little bit poorly positioned until Thanos really rushes back into the metagame. The more Thanos there is, the better Loki is. And that is just sort of the dynamic the two are going to have for a while. I've even run into people playing Loki in Thanos for that mirror edge, and it's like, sure, fine. I got nothing against that. I think that's totally fine. I don't think it's like a game breaker or anything, but it's smart, and we've talked about it previously. As far as Loki, a dedicated deck goes, it's probably about as bad as it's been ever, which is to say it's still worth talking about, it's still worth running, but there are just kind of a lot of decks where you're just like, I got nothing out of this Loki. That's not good at all. And I think that is probably a good thing for the metagame as a whole, that there are plenty of viable decks that do not instantly lose to Loki. If the metagame was entirely, Hope Thanos and Hope Move, then Loki would be absolutely phenomenal. But there are too many people trying too many different things, and too many of those things are genuinely not good Loki targets. This is the Hela deck from X Quality Dark that top 8'd the Snap.Fan World Championship, and it is a bit of a unique take in my eyes. It's sacrificing the consistency that previous Hela decks had with Lockjaw and just saying, I'm going to be a Corvus Glaive deck, can you stop me? This is the kind of deck I envisioned wanting Corvus Glaive when the card originally came out, and I'm glad to see it's found its way into the shell because, you discard the Hela, that obviously sucks, but you still have a quasi-viable ramp plan. You have this Morbius, who's actually going to be pretty big a lot of the time. It's a little bit weaker than it was with Lockjaw, for sure, but this is a deck that can high roll very heavily, and being able to high roll very heavily when you look at how mid-rangey all the rest of what we're looking at is still a very relevant thing. I do have some worries for this deck's longevity. Can it actually beat a good Phoenix Force roll? Can it beat a Shuri Nimrod? Things of that nature. These were not questions that were really being asked of it in the previous meta, and it was better in the previous meta too. So we'll see where Hela ends up taking point here. Right now, I think this is obviously a playable deck. And whether or not it's a good one, it's a little bit too early to say, but it's very clearly something you can still be doing. You just have to have a high tolerance for risk when you're playing a Corvus Glaive deck. Duuruk went undefeated with Black Knight in the first day of the Snap.Fan World Championship, and so I'm highlighting his list instead of the Annihilus version, just to talk about what exactly is the upside of this list. He was the only person playing Black Knight in the entire field. He did not lose a single game, And that is an incredibly powerful, and the accomplishment sort of speaks for itself, right? Like, this is a deck that has a lot of upside right now in terms of just putting uninteractable power on the board. That's a good thing to do. Uninteractable power, generally something you're interested in when a lot of decks are running Shang-Chi, and it's also a deck that is pretty good into Loki. Based on his record, I'm unclear exactly what he played against, but I'd imagine he at least ran into a few Thani in that matchup, and I gotta say, while I do think Thanos is likely to be favored, at least in my head, I'm looking at it, I'm like, all right, Thanos feels like it's probably ahead here. I'm very impressed with his ability to leverage the tech cards and the power here to make that not happen. One of the things that I think is a little bit underrated in terms of why Black Knight fell off a bit is that Thanos was doing the same thing and had Kyera in it. Now that Kyera isn't in it, this deck can really leverage that Shang-Chi in the matchup. And that is the kind of thing that I think may have gone unnoticed if this guy did not go 6-0. I'm impressed with the deck building, and I'm impressed with the play, and we will have to see where Black Knight goes from here. Obviously, this is not like the world's most revolutionary Black Knight deck, but going back to the basics after something big changes in the metagame, like Thanos losing Kyera, allowing this deck to be more of a Shang-Chi deck than it was previously and actually get value out of that, I think that's a pretty impressive move. Hawk Summers remains a deck that will get you some wins. I do think that there's so many question marks in the metagame right now that I feel a little bit iffy about playing it, though. This is a deck that is not overwhelmingly good into anything doing combo stuff. The lack of interaction here in this list is meant to target the Loki matchup, so you just give your Loki opponents things that aren't very good. That's totally fine. Your job is to, like, clog the Thanos player. That's totally fine. But outside of those matchups, I feel very awkward when I play this list into something that actually just, like, arbitrarily goes extremely big. Phoenix Force, Hela, Living Tribunal, things like that are really tough to deal with, right? And for that reason, it ends up in this spot on the tier list. It's not a specific power level ranking, but I would say if I was doing a specific power level ranking, this would be about where I would start, like tier 2, probably, where this is a playable deck that is quite playable, but I'm not really sure exactly how far it can go without the tech because the metagame has diversified so much that there are situations that, like, you just absolutely have no answers to, and it's very hard to be in those situations, at least for a player like me. The other Anni Bounce deck is in much the same situation, although I think this one might actually be a little bit underrated at this point. Everyone's a little bit stuck on, like, we got to try Hope Summers and everything, and I wouldn't be shocked if this ended up being good at some point. One thing that I will note, though, is that it does seem to be, again, it has the same major issue, right? Like, you have your tech, right? But it's not solving the problems you need it to solve. Your tech cards are not solving a Hela. Your tech cards are not solving a Phoenix Force. And so this deck might need a little bit of work before it actually ends up being what it was in previous metagames. Annihilus, I will say, has felt about as bad as he's ever felt. There are so many decks that are focused on Hope Summers, which means there's so many decks that are able to fill up lanes without actually taking significant damage from that. And that means that Annihilus is kind of at an all-time low, in my humble opinion. Now, Annihilus and Sentry, like, that's still really strong, but it might just not be the time for this kind of deck. Ragettt TTT, top 8 of the SnapFan Invitational, the SnapFan World Championship by, I'm so used to calling things Invitational because of Star City Games. I don't really know why. I just am. The Snap.Fan World Championship, although he was the only 4-2 to make it as opposed to going 5-1 in the 6 rounds. With a unique move deck, I saw something similar last season from Shuri Enjoyer. It's pretty much the same list, maybe a couple of changes. I know Shuri Enjoyer at the time was running one tech card instead of Hercules. This deck is effectively trying to compete for the spot of deck that goes over the top and use Beast as a method of preventing you from getting tech carded, right? So this deck is competing with Phoenix Force, Nimrod stuff, right? You can just go for big numbers. But it's also, thanks to Beast, attempting to compete for the discard and move slot, right? Where it's like, I'm a deck that's very hard to interact with, but still does a lot of points. And a lot of this deck comes down to play skill. It's a very tough deck to play, identifying which of those roles you want to actually take. Do you want to go for max points? Do you want to go for max non-interactivity? Do you want to go for a Heimdall in the final turn of the game, knowing that your opponents are playing around it? How do you want to handle this? Can you get your beast down and get the value you need out of it? How do you handle these situations? It's a very difficult deck to play, very dependent on reads, but I do think by hybridizing those roles, right? It's almost like occupying a similar space as Black Knight, where it is a combination hard to interact with and very tall deck. And I think that's a reasonable space to try to occupy, and it's definitely worth investigating if this archetype can end up being real. I do think it has massive point potential, but it also has to balance that against the interactivity of its opponents. Cards like Shadow King and Shang-Chi can be quite dangerous, as can cards like Killmonger on a Human Torch. These are pretty scary things to deal with. It also has to deal with a general inconsistency in terms of if you don't have multiple things that are scaling, a dagger and a vulture, you kind of run short on points some of the time. You end up being like, oh, I'm going to Spider-Man 2099 into Heimdall, and it's like, that's beatable and fairly predictable, and so you end up in a very odd spot a lot of the time when this deck actually plays. However, I think it is actually good and should be on this tier list. Destroy is in a bit of a plausible spot, I would say. It's a deck that is known and good and unexciting and pretty much just doing what it was always doing. And because the metagame went from, Hela to Phoenix Force and Hela to there's a lot of stuff that still unfortunately necessitates that I run Arnim Zola in this deck, basically. Just a lot of stuff that's like, man, I really wish I didn't have to run this Zola, but in order to have the point potential to try to beat these guys on the back end, I need to run this Zola. It's kind of awkward, right? Because the way I want to approach those matchups against Phoenix Force against Hela is by trying to go way taller than they can, and the best way to do that is run Zola, but at the same time, it's that's a card that's mostly not going to help you in other matchups, and so you end up having to dedicate basically a slot to it, and it's very awkward, right? There's also a bit of an increase in Mobius M. Mobius running around, which makes my death feel a little bit worse, and almost really makes me want to run Lady Deathstrike in there, but I can't because I need that spot for the Arnim Zola, or I end up just being smaller than all the combo decks. One thing that this deck does do well, though, is it bullies decks like Discard that just don't have the ability to go as tall, right? If you are doing what you do in a deck like this, and Discard is doing what they do in their deck, you're going to win. You get to be their big brother, give them a noogie, put them in a headlock, and just let that ride. That is a good place to be, but not the best place to be, because Discard previously, I would say before the Hope Move stuff came out, pretty definitively the best deck in the hard to interact with but does a lot of points category. Now, I think it's a little bit tougher to tell, and the Hope Move deck has at least Shang-Chi, and my build has Shadow King, and both of those are really good against you. And so Destroy is in a little bit of an awkward spot, where previously I would have said this is a slam dunk gimme, you can absolutely play this. I do think that right now it's a little bit more, I would say, frazzled. The high evolutionary pixie decks are doing okay, and I think they've had enough success that I feel comfortable putting them on this tier list, if only because it gives me an excuse to take She-Naut off of this tier list. That makes me very, very happy that I can finally just say, all right, if you were going to play She-Naut, I would probably play this instead. We'll see how well that advice ages. I do think this is occupying a pretty similar space to a lot of other decks, and unfortunately, it ends up in a situation where if your opponent plays the card Mobius M. Mobius, your deck just kind of turns off. You end up extremely sad a lot of the time. I think we'll have to see further experimentation in this space to sort of see what Hope Evo ends up looking like. I'm not overly convinced Pixie is necessary for this stuff to work. I think we might be able to push the archetype forward without Pixie, but hey, that's just my opinion. We'll see how this deck keeps evolving. I'm glad that we finally managed to power creep She-Naut. Very happy for that. That said, I'm not overly into this deck, and if you don't have Pixie, I am not telling you to buy Pixie for this. One thing that you may have noticed while we were going through every deck on this tier list is an unbelievable lack of the card Enchantress. And whenever I go through a tier list and I'm like, Boy, there's not a lot of Enchantress on here, is there? I kind of think it might be time to recommend Living Tribunal again. So, here's Living Tribunal. You are going to go taller than everything else in the game when you nut draw. You are going to be the combo deck that beats the other combo decks, but in exchange, you are far more vulnerable to disruption along the lines of Magneto, along the lines of getting rid of your Limbo, along the lines of Enchantress or Rogue. That is the trade-off you make when you play one of these decks. That is simply just how it has to be. I personally am of the belief that if I were going to play a Tribunal deck, if I thought Tribunal was well positioned, the one I would be playing is the traditional build. I know a lot of people have been playing the negative build, which we'll talk about in just a second. I personally would recommend the traditional build because the way I think of the negative build is an attempt to make Living Tribunal viable in metas where it otherwise would not be. And I think in metas where it otherwise would not be, I would simply rather switch decks. So, I mean, if you really want to, you can play the negative build too. if you are, I think there's like some genuine equity in the sense of like, you are able to do things on the final turn that your opponents won't be expecting. But I also think this deck might be well known enough and clunk enough that unless you're really good at snapping and really good at playing and really good at understanding, hey, I'm going to get Goliath here. Hey, I'm going to get Enchantress here, right? Like, unless you're really A1 on all that stuff, I don't know if this deck is the pick. I'm going to be honest with you. Like I said, in metagames where I would rather play this over the traditional Tribunal, I'd rather just play neither. I think this deck also has some pretty significant Mobius weaknesses. I mean, the original Tribunal deck does, but they are significantly exacerbated by this. And I do think that that is, not the end of the world, just it's not a deck I would seriously recommend unless you're a very specific type of combo play. Thank you so much for watching. I have been KMBest. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you with me for this entire amount of time. As always, remember to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed any decks. This was a monster of an episode. Like, I am kind of out of breath talking about it right now. There was so much to cover. I probably did miss some stuff. I know someone's going to be like Sarah, but I just haven't found a build I actually like. They all feel like I'm doing absolutely nothing. And that's sort of where I'm at with that. But remember, please like, subscribe, turn notifications on. Let me know if you think I missed anything. This is a crazily open meta right now. I'm hoping by like next week, we'll have sort of whittled it down a bit and figured out which decks are best at occupying these traditional metagame roles of, hard to interact with Midrange Deck, Thanos doing the ramp thing, whatever combo deck ends up coming out on top doing the combo deck thing. Or maybe they're all just so close in power that you can just pick one and run with it. I think those are the ones that are the best metagames, where like there are like 3 competitors for the major metagame roles, and we're not actually sure which one's the best. And that's sort of how I feel right now. So, as always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I still read them all.